So I ran up a little more debt on your credit card. Took your car keys too. I figure, well, you're not going to be needing them. Of course, if you have any issues with any of this, you just have to say so.
If it makes you feel sick watching it happen to them,
Okay, great.
we shouldn't let it happen to you, your friends, or your family. Elder abuse is everyone's business. Visit cotawa.org.au to find out more.
Good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important elder abuse forum, and it is a sector forum. We will be talking this morning about how the sector responds to the mistreatment of older people. What you've just seen is a TV commercial that was aired in 2020 that was produced by COTA WA. It was all about raising awareness of elder abuse in the community. COTA WA has partnered with Northern Suburbs Legal Community Centres to deliver this forum today. My name is Christine Allen. I'm the CEO of COTA WA. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. We here are on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and you may be watching from other lands. But on all of our behalf, I pay respects to elders past and present, and you're all very welcome. I'd also like to introduce our speakers today. So we have Gianna Renshaw, Deputy Head of Department Social Work for Sir Charles Gardner Hospital in Osborne Park. We have Irene Mooney, CEO of My Vista, who provide residential aged care, retirement living and home care. We have Rowena Petronas, Senior Solicitor from Northern Suburbs Community Legal Centres, who also deliver the Older People's Rights Service. And we have Damien Brown, Senior Sergeant with the WA Police Family Violence Division. So this forum is for anyone who, in the course of their working life, comes into contact with the various forms of elder abuse. So you might be a member of the police force, you might be a social worker, an aged care worker, you may provide legal support, financial advice, you may be an advocate or a carer. I want to highlight some of the work being funded by the state government at the moment. So the University of WA, CSI department, have been commissioned by Department of Communities to undertake a study into the prevalence of elder abuse in WA. Now that report will be released later on this year, and there are organisations funded by the state government to respond to elder abuse. Those organisations who are funded include the Northern Suburbs Community Legal Centres, Advocare, and an additional $4 million has been allocated to legal aid to establish Elder Rights WA. COTA WA is funded as the peak body for vulnerable older people. And in fact, in our role as the peak body, we have a newly developed seniors guide, and this is something that we will be launching this afternoon. It's actually a guide for older people, and it is called Understanding the Mistreatment of Older People. And we hope that you will use the guide as a reference tool for the sector, but it is a guide that we have developed for seniors. I would encourage you as our audience here today to use the chat function. We really want to hear about your experiences, your challenges, your positive outcomes, and your feedback is important to us as the peak body in working with the government to develop responses to elder abuse. So during this session, we will hear about the response to elder abuse from 4 different sectors. from legal, from health, from law enforcement, and from aged care. And each of our speakers will talk about their sector's response, so their framework and their protocols. So I'm going to begin with the Western Australian Government's definition of elder abuse, and this definition aligns to the World Health Organization description of 2008. And that is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action that occurs in a relationship with an older person where there is an expectation of trust and where that action causes harm or distress to the older person. So we know that elder abuse is a complex issue that takes many forms and can involve multiple people, including family members, legal guardians, professional carers and advocates, including social workers and aged care workers, lawyers, the Office of the Public Advocate and the Public Trustee, the police force, or any other concerned parties. The purpose of this session is to provide clarity for our sector workers on the existing resources available for responding to elder abuse. And just as elder abuse takes many forms, the response can also require a complex approach, which in some cases is difficult to find a resolution when the victim is at risk and may not wish to take action. There may also be capacity issues. But today's focus is on what we can do within the existing resources that we have. So we're now going to hear from our first speaker, and I introduce to you Gianna Renshaw.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to be talking about responding to elder abuse within the health system, and particularly from a social work perspective. And just to set the scene of, I suppose, the settings that we come across elder abuse. Firstly, we have the inpatient setting where social workers are working with older people who have become inpatients in the hospital system. We also work with older people in the outpatient setting, where older people are coming along to memory clinic, to continence clinic, a whole range of clinics that we have in that outpatient setting within the hospitals. And then finally, we have aged care assessment team assessors who are seeing older people in the community, and they are made up of both social workers and nurses who are seeing older people in their own homes and assessing people for support services, either residential or home care. Our approach to elder abuse is, as far as our response goes, is three-pronged. We see that we have a responsibility to raise awareness of elder abuse amongst all health professionals, so that they are looking for the signs. We have a responsibility for screening for elder abuse in a respectful and dignified manner. And then finally, we are responsible for developing intervention plans to address elder abuse once it's identified. I just want to start off with the question of why is it, sort of a social work task to take the lead in the health system in regard to elder abuse, and the sort of the main issues that relate to elder abuse that lead to social work intervention is quite often there's very strong emotional and social ties that are part of the abusive relationship. There's quite often a fear of prosecution of the abuser. There's quite often a lot of shame for the older person in what's happening to them. And also a perceived dependency on the abuser for income and social networks, and the fear of losing these. There's a lot of anxiety about estrangement from the abuser, and also about adjusting to any change that might have to come about if the abuser wasn't in their life. And then finally, there's cultural factors that may impact on the perceptions of elder abuse, and how people, different cultures may see something as abusive or not abusive. Again, quite often we look at, sort of being proactive with managing elder abuse once it is identified. And we take sort of a 6-step approach to responding to elder abuse. The first step is to identify whether the abuse is taking place, and we do that by interviewing questions to help us identify some of the signs and symptoms of elder abuse, and also gathering information from other sources if possible, for example relatives, friends, neighbours and other carers. And the sorts of abuse that we're quite often identifying include financial or material abuse, and that's improper use of the older person's finances or assets. Quite often what we see in the health system is families not proceeding with residential care or community care due to the costs, and that's quite a common thing that we come across. Neglect, the failure to provide the necessities of life, such as adequate food, shelter, care and emotional support. Emotional or psychological abuse, inflicting mental anguish, fear or feelings of shame and powerlessness. Social abuse, preventing an older person from having social contacts outside of the household or the particular abusive relationship. Physical abuse, deliberately causing physical pain or injury. And then finally, sexual abuse, and that can be very broad range of unwanted sexual behaviour. It can be a son reading pornographic material and leaving, sort of the material around for the older person, and they may find that very difficult to cope with. And even, nakedness around the home can be quite offensive to an older person. So they are, some of the things that we do come across. So the first step is to go through that process of gathering the information to identify the abuse. Then we provide emotional support. We listen to the person's story, we acknowledge what they are saying, and we validate their feelings. We then move on to assessing the level of risk and determining, sort of whether the person is safe to be left in that setting, whether there's an urgency to remove them, and this is where we start to develop a safety plan. And in that safety plan, again, I suppose before we sort of develop the safety plan, we start looking at the person's capacity and whether they do have the capacity to make the decision to stay in the abusive relationship if that's what they're choosing to do. And so, a safety plan may involve, sort of educating the older person about sort of contacting the police if they are in a situation where they feel at risk. It may be as simple as going to a safe place, such as a neighbour. So it can be a whole range of things. So quite often we will work with the older person as to what's going to suit them depending on the level of abuse. And then we look at trying to refer the person on to sort of make links for them. Quite often a big factor with an older person that's being abused is that they're socially isolated. And so we see sort of a link to other supports as quite critical so that if they're staying in the abusive situation, there is people monitoring them and available to support them. What we find with older people, sort of choosing to stay in abusive relationships, it's quite often because they feel they don't have the choice. Once they have got carers coming in and there to support them, sort of they can move on to the stage of realising that they don't have to continue in that situation. And the final step in our 6 steps is to document the process. And again, we always document, but particularly when a person is staying in a situation where there is an element of risk, we will document what the plan is so that we can support the person onto the next stages as required. At Osborne Park Hospital many years ago, we were in a situation of feeling quite frustrated of not knowing, where to go as far as, once someone determines that they are being abused. So we developed an elder abuse pathway for our social workers. That outlines, the first step of doing that psychosocial assessment to determine whether there is abuse or not. The next step is looking at the capacity issue and engaging with medical staff to determine if there is a capacity issue. And it's quite important, this issue of capacity, because it determines, what we do next as far as linking into supports and services. If the person doesn't have capacity, then we're quite often linking in to a state administrative tribunal application for guardianship so that someone can be assisting that person to make decisions to not be in the abusive situation. If the person has capacity, it's very much that support role and trying to engage them and link them into supports in the community. And that can, be getting an assessment from the aged care assessment team so that they can get home support services, or for those that are quite frail and needing 24-hour care, it may mean having to look at residential care. The sorts of things that we're asking is, can the abuse be stopped in the current care arrangements? So that's quite a critical question for us. And what sort of supports do we need to engage to stop that abuse? The risk factors that we're quite often looking for in our assessments are dependency. So quite often, that establishing that there is a dependency is a concern. The older person may be dependent on others for social, emotional, physical and financial and spiritual support. This vulnerability is increased when the abuser is also dependent on the older person, so that codependency increases it even further. Family dynamics and their living arrangements, unresolved issues, family conflict, spousal violence, as well as shared living arrangements may heighten the risk of conflict and abuse. Social isolation that I've mentioned already, the older person may be isolated by location, mobility, physical impairments, intellectual impairment or language and cultural barriers. And then health and cognitive impairment, which we all know as a person gets older, they're at a much higher risk of. That certainly puts them at a higher risk of abuse. Addictions, alcohol, prescription or illicit drug use, gambling addictions on the part of the older person or the carer may increase the risk of abuse. And carer stress. This may lead to abuse, especially when combined with the other risk factors. such as social isolation and or addiction on the part of the family carer. And finally, language and cultural barriers can also be risk factors, and they may be heightened, by historical influences or immigration experiences and the trauma that comes from that. So that's a summary of what we do as social workers in the health system. So thank you.
Thanks, Gianna. And obviously Gianna is talking to us from the perspective of the health department or social worker perspective. We're now going to cross to Irene Mooney, and we're going to hear about the perspective from the aged care sector. Thanks, Irene.
Thanks, Christine, and for the opportunity, and welcome to all of you that are listening. I want to start off, when I prepared for today, I actually thought the best way would be to look at what governance structures are already in place within the aged care sector that we can use to actually protect people, and particularly older people. And if we start off with the Aged Care Act, which governs all of what any approved aged care provider has to abide by and live by and report by. But it's a great framework and structure, because under that there are several things. There's the quality principles, which from that comes the quality and safety standards, which are the standards that we get assessed against. And there's a 3-year assessment process, and it's assessors come in and look at the standards, and through those standards, every standard, there's 8 standards, one being governance, but all of them wrapped together and combined together, and the whole aim is to put the consumer or the customer at the centre of all care provided and make sure it's delivered in a quality and safe manner at all times for all people. And I think also from that we have the Complaints Commission, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Complaints Commission, who anyone can ring up. It could be a staff member, it could be a consumer, it could be a visitor, it could be a contractor. So there's a great mechanism there that you can make an anonymous complaint about anything you may see, and they will investigate. So if someone suspects or thinks there's elder abuse happening, or they have a suspicion that there's neglect, or even just that maybe someone's not doing the right thing as they would like it to be, then they can make a complaint, and that's anonymous. And that's a great governance structure, because it provides everyone the opportunity to have their voice heard, and it can be an advocate or the person themselves, or a staff member or a workforce member. Recently, the changes to what used to be called the restraints management process, it's now called minimisation of restrictive practices, of which we have to report in residential aged care on a monthly, 3-monthly cycle to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. And this picks up things around people being restricted, whether it be physical, in an environment, and we have to report on why they're being used and how they're being used and how frequently. And that gives the Commission an understanding, and it should give the public and also the consumers of aged care some level of understanding and, I suppose, confidence that there is things in place that are monitoring what's actually going on in aged care. I mean, we all know what happened and what came out through the Aged Care Royal Commission. And as an aged care provider and an active member within the aged care industry, we were horrified with what we were hearing. And so some of these mechanisms have been put in place since then. Some of them were there before, but they've just been enhanced. And that's also another area that is allowing the public to have confidence that when people are having aged care provided to them through an approved aged care provider, that there is something else besides the aged care provider looking at what's happening. There's also the Serious Incident Response Scheme, which is also another new scheme that came out of the Royal Commission recommendations. And that covers a whole range, and particularly it covers things around financial abuse, whether it be alleged or known, and it covers sexual abuse, neglect, missing residents who might walk away or be away from the facility for a period of time and require the police to look for them. So all of those things as well are reported. Some of those need to involve the police, so anything that's in regard to physical, sexual abuse or someone missing for 24 hours. Within 24-hour period, the aged care provider has to actually contact the police, and the police then come and undertake an investigation. There's another level of layer of security. It also is a layer of confidence and security for the staff that work in aged care, because we work in a 24-hour system in residential aged care and in some community home care packages. And the staff also want to know that their colleagues are picking up things and that the people they care for are actually safe and there's nothing happening to them that shouldn't be happening to them. I've mentioned the police. I mean, we don't like to ring the police just, you know, willy-nilly. We don't tell the police, we don't tell the staff, ring the police if you're unsure. But if there's an emergency, if there is a requirement under the mandatory structure to ring the police, or if they feel there is actually a criminal act going on, then they will call the police. And you'll hear later from Damien, there are mechanisms there that will help people walk through whether or not the police are the right people to be calling as well. The Office of Public Advocate, they cover the structure around enduring power of attorney, looking after people's finances or someone else picking that up, or jury empowering of guardianship. And for aged care providers, that's really around how people make medical choices where they live. That mechanism is there to protect the consumer. It also allows people with capacity to have ongoing support and care by perhaps people who are more able to provide those nuances around what they would like and not like their loved one or their friend or whoever it is that's been appointed on that guardianship. But as an aged care provider or someone working in aged care, we shouldn't ever think that we can't use that office to actually alert them if we feel that someone's not using that EPA or enduring power of guardianship appropriately. We are often also sitting in on interviews or writing and filling out documentation supporting someone's request for an EPA or enduring power of guardianship. And we've also will sometimes link up and give our thoughts and opinions about what we see if there's any dispute about some of whoever is the EPA or enduring power and guardianship. There's the Older Persons Rights Service, and there's an elder abuse helpline that we have available to us. That's a fairly broad governance structure, and for aged care providers, using those structures and that governance structure not only gives them a framework to work to make sure that when I go home at night that I can sleep and know that our organisation is providing people safe, appropriate, quality care, but also for their families. And I believe this is a great opportunity now as we talk about elder abuse, and particularly for the aged care industry. The Royal Commission has highlighted a lot of things that we're doing wrong. I think what I'd like to walk through and hope that we can promote is that we also do a lot of things right. And it's not necessarily that we're going to do it right all the time, but it's how we as providers and people working in the industry respond when things don't go right, and we do it with respect and dignity for everyone around us. Often as aged care providers, we are not just having to protect the person who we might feel has been abused, but we also need to work with sensitivity and respect for the person who might be the perpetrator of that abuse, because they are that loved one for that person and they might be their only contact. And you don't want to break and fracture those relationships when that might be how a person gets up in the morning and keeps their day and keeps positive, and that's who they love, and it might be what they know. So it's a difficult area, and for staff working in it, there are several things that as an organisation, and for most of the colleagues that I know in aged care, that we have in place. And it starts with education and training on staff around what elder abuse is about and about how you manage that. And that's not saying that the care worker or the cleaner necessarily has to be the one that manages it and has the conversation, but making sure they know where to go and that someone's going to listen to what they're saying, because they might not be able to put it in words or context that is as easy to understand, but if you've got your listening ears on as an aged care provider, you will understand that they're trying to tell you that something's not right and they'd like you to investigate it. There's also a good supervisory and management structure within aged care, because residential aged care is 24/7. Retirement living usually has an emergency contact system, and home care also has out-of-hours contacts in place. There is always someone there that can help, and it's making sure those people have the guidelines and the resources to know what to do when they receive information about suspected or actual abuse. For My Vista, we have CCTV in our residential aged care and our common areas, and initially, a few years back, I'm saying 10 years ago, I was very worried about having CCTV and how that would make, residents feel, family feel, workforce feel. But I have to say, it is a great comfort, because it also allows families to maybe see that when mum or dad fell in the corridor, they can see that there was no one there that pushed or did that to them. But it also sometimes does capture people doing things that they shouldn't do or being a bit more forceful than they should, and you actually have a visual account of that, which helps you then to have those conversations and progress where you go in dealing with that incident. Having a really good incident management system and reporting system so that people feel safe. It's really important that staff feel that when they report something, particularly if it's alleged or a gut feel they're sensing, there's someone safe they can talk to, and that they're not going to be blamed if it proves to not be right. That's very important, no blame. Also, having an awareness program and talking about elder abuse with the residents and their families and visitors. And My Vista was very lucky to be involved in the Purple Road program, which allowed us to have a great opportunity to talk about elder abuse with our residents as they were making and putting together crocheted and knitted squares to put together for the Purple Road blanket. And I think it really helped them to understand that there were people thinking about them, and these things still happen in the community, and they still have contacts with networks, and it could be their own daughter or son that they feel is in an abusive situation as well. My Vista is heritage is in Southern European backgrounds, so cultural diversity is very dear to our hearts. And English as a second language and different cultures does mean that you need to be very aware about how you might approach or talk about elder abuse and how people might respond to that. And we also have a broad range of staff from a variety of different backgrounds. And so they also bring their own cultural nuances and suspicions around elder abuse and authority and reporting things. So we have to navigate through that. But you can do that through, we've developed a cultural diversity charter for the organisation, which has been done as a co-design project, and we're about this year to redo that again with our staff and our families and our visitors and our contractors. Because that helps people to talk about it and accept that we're all talking about a common cause and a common outcome, which is we want to keep people safe and we want to give older people the best life that we can. We have a zero tolerance for any abuse, and this doesn't mean we come down with a heavy hand on that, but we do take action very quickly, and that protects everybody. It protects not only the person that may have had the abuse, but it also protects the people around them and our staff, because it's a difficult area to work in, and I feel staff need that support But they also need to know if there's someone amongst the workforce who's not doing the right thing, that their voice is going to be heard, and they're going to have that person not working with them anymore, because that'll make them feel uncomfortable as well. And the last thing is, we've also got the mandatory quality indicators that we report on, and those also pick up things like neglect and abuse, because if someone is pushed or handled a bit too roughly, and that might not be the workforce, they might have gone out for the day with a family member, or it could be in the home, then those things are reported and investigated. And it's that investigation that actually gives you that depth of what's the root cause of this, and it allows you then to put in place things around dignity of risk to assist people to still live a life and maybe accept some risks, but put some strategies in place to either eliminate it or minimise it. And like most things in aged care, we're always wanting to improve. And by reviewing and having us look at ourselves and reflect, and have other people reflect on how well we do, helps us to make sure that people stay safe as best we can within the frameworks that we have at our disposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. We're now going to hear from Rowena, and she will talk about the perspective of organisations providing legal support for people dealing with elder abuse. Rowena.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today. It's been wonderful hearing the health and aged care perspectives. I've certainly been learning a lot as we've been going on. I'm just going to put into perspective I am a lawyer at the Northern Suburbs Community Legal Centre. The Northern Suburbs Community Legal Centre is a generalist community legal centre, and it is a not-for-profit organisation. It has multiple programs, but the program that I'm involved with is called the Older People's Rights Service, which you may have heard of often as OPRIS. OPRIS is funded solely by the Department of Communities to provide a free legal service to older people who are at risk of or experiencing elder abuse. OPRIS has been around for many years. We provide legal advice and ongoing support to people, older people, throughout Western Australia. So although we are operated by the Northern Suburbs Community Legal Centre, we aren't limited to helping people in the Northern Suburbs. It is actually Western Australia wide. So that's a really important thing to note. We are able to help all people who are over 65 years of age or 55 years of age if they're from Aboriginal descent. And importantly, the people have to be at risk of or experiencing elder abuse. And that's elder abuse that's coming from where they're experiencing harm from a trusted person. And that trusted person is usually a family member, a friend, a neighbour, but it's not where the harm has been caused by a professional service, so not by an aged care provider, as we've just been listening to from Irene. Really importantly, all the legal advice and assistance that we provide, it's free. It's also not means tested, and that's incredibly important for older people who often own their own homes, who may otherwise not be able, who may be asset rich, not income rich, but may otherwise not be able to access services. We also have a really flexible model in how we deliver our service. We completely understand that mobility issues, access to transport can be some real barriers to older people being able to access help that they need, particularly legal help, and it's also something that can be part of the abuse that they're experiencing. So for that reason, we are happy to do house visits. We might go and visit them at aged care centres or anywhere else that the older person feels safe and comfortable to be able to talk about their situation. Importantly, we are also really flexible around the time. When we don't have time constraints, we don't have 30 minutes appointments. Our appointments can take as long as the older person needs to be able to tell their story, to be heard, and then for us to be able to provide them with some advice. And it's not unusual that the first session takes 2 hours to get to that point. We're often talking about really complex things, and it really does take an older person, particularly in the context of where they might be experiencing harm or abuse from a family member that they're living with, to be able to get to the point that they can safely talk about their situation. Our team is also made up of it's a multidisciplinary team. So we have lawyers, we have advocates, we have a financial educator, and we also have a team of volunteers who provide peer-to-peer education to raise awareness around elder abuse through their participation in networks, through attending public events, and importantly in delivering community education to community groups or associations where there are older people to talk about and to share and talk about elder abuse. And the Purple Road initiative, which Irene had talked about, is one of the great ways that our volunteers actually start the conversation about elder abuse in a really non-confronting way. It's really important from the outset that as lawyers, we can only provide assistance, and our clients can only be the older person who's experiencing the abuse. We are often contacted by concerned family members, friends, or service providers, but it's really important that it has to be the older person who is our client. We're also often asked by concerned family members if they might have a letter of authority from the older person and says, but I have authority from the older person to be able to deal with you. And we have to be very clear in saying that we cannot provide, we cannot act on instructions from a third party. It must be the older person. The only time that we can actually provide legal and assistance and support to a third person is when there is a proper legal authority, such as an enduring power of attorney, that specifically deals with the type of matter that we're involved with. As lawyers, we do have a duty to protect our clients' confidentiality and their privacy. And that's a really big thing, because in this space, quite often, whether it's out of genuine concern or whether it is for vested interests, often family members or friends will try and contact us and to try and find out information, what we've shared with that older person. And we have to be really clear, both with our client and with them, to say our client is the older person, that we are bound by confidentiality. And also another benefit that our older people who become our clients have is legal privilege, which is essentially that any legal advice that we provide to them or communication around it is protected. And that's really important, because that's another way that older people feel more comfortable to disclose what's going on without fear. Whenever we're working with a client, our guiding principle is always, and this is really consistent with our legal obligations, it's that we have to act in the best interest of our client, and they are our focus, and that means we have to act also on their proper instructions. So that means we'll support them with their rights, and that includes their right to make decisions, to take risks, to refuse supports or interventions, so long as they have the ability to weigh up and understand that that's what the decision is. The starting point always is that the client has capacity. And that's something that quite often we have to remind family members, friends, even professional services working with that older person who we may have permission or authority from our client to talk to. It's probably also important to say that whenever we do encourage clients, certainly at the first appointment, to come in by themselves so that we know that the story that they're giving us is free from influence or interference, but we also do welcome them to come in with a support person if that's what they're going to need to feel comfortable. And ideally, that's a support person who's not already involved in any of the conflict that's going on around them. As lawyers, we aren't trained and we're not required to be experts in mental capacity. Essentially, when we see a client, one of the first things we do have to consider is whether or not they have the capacity to provide instructions. So that is to be able to give us a true reflection of the facts of their situation, to be able to weigh up our advice and then to give us instructions about how to act. If we do have concerns about our client's capacity, then the first thing that we will do is get their permission to talk to their doctor and get input from their doctor or another appropriate medical professional into whether or not they have capacity to provide instructions for the type of work that we're doing, including the capacity to instruct us as lawyers. It's really difficult when we start talking about capacity because capacity is decision specific. So even the test for capacity, for example, as to whether or not they can instruct me to commence court proceedings is even different to whether or not they could instruct me to draw up a will, which is even different again to drawing up an enduring power of attorney. And then to make things even more complex, we have to remember that capacity is fluid. So it's not unusual that the first time that I sit down with an older person and they tell me their story and I say, fantastic, they've got capacity. And then I go and see them on the second occasion and they can't really remember any of the things that we've talked about on the first occasion, including who I am or why they've even come to the appointment. It's really important also to remember that when we are assessing capacity, we are talking about the decision-making process. We're not talking about the decisions that they're making. And quite often this is something, again, that, where our role is really to empower the older person in this situation. Capacity is quite often coming up in the context of family conflict, where there are issues about what level of support needs and independence that older person has. And often the older person's voice in that process is getting lost. Throughout the older person's involvement with OPRIS, or the Older People's Rights Service, it will start out with them talking to one of our advocates who will then be available to support them throughout our involvement with them. And that's really important because often, we are seeing cases of where people are wanting advice. For example, they've allowed an adult family member to move back into the home and now they're experiencing issues with that person, they're feeling afraid and they want help to get that older person out. But the consequences to that older person, if they take action of having them leave the house, of them being homeless, there might be grandchildren involved, really means that the older person needs a lot of support through this process. And it's probably really important also just to come back when I talk about the issue of capacity. There are certainly clients where or people who at the beginning it's very clear that they have capacity, they're able to make decisions themselves without any help. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are not even able to make very simple decisions, for example, how they might manage their money day to day, and they actually need a substitute decision maker. But for the majority of older people, and certainly our clients, they fall in the in-between. People who have capacity but really need support to be able to make decisions. And it's the need for the support which makes them vulnerable, and it's that which also can lead to them becoming victims of elder abuse. OPRIS is funded to provide both preventative measures when it comes to elder abuse and also remedial. So some of the ways that OPRIS can assist older people is we actually provide free legal and advice and assistance to all older people to draft up enduring powers of attorney. So an enduring power of attorney is a document where they appoint someone to be able to make money decisions on their behalf, and that document can start either straight away or when that person loses capacity. And this is really important because firstly it gives the older person the opportunity to appoint someone that they want to be making decisions on their behalf rather than the people around them. And it's also incredibly important because in Western Australia, unlike some of the other states, there's no requirements that a lawyer is involved in the process of drawing up an enduring power of attorney. And that means quite often some of the abuse that we are seeing is where the older person has been forced by an adult child, it might be their primary carer or a friend, to actually, they'll take them down to the local chemist and force them to sign this document. And then that can create some real angst for the older person because often they don't even know what they've signed. The other thing that we do is we certainly provide free legal advice and assistance to drafting enduring powers of guardianship. So again, that's a legal document appointing someone to make personal decisions for that older person. And some of the key decisions that are being made under those documents are whether or not the older person can continue to live at home or whether they need to go into a nursing home and whether or not aged care supports can be provided or appropriate. And that can quite often be a real bone of conflict within the family and for that older person. We also really encourage services to try and get older people to come in and get advice proactively. So if they hear that an older person is considering selling their house and moving into their family member with what's called an assets for care or granny flat arrangement, we really strongly recommend that they get that client to get some legal advice first so we can actually talk them through all the risks of that process. And sometimes these arrangements work incredibly well if there's been a full and frank discussion about what the risks are rather than the person selling up their home, moving in with a family member, the arrangement goes pear-shaped and then you end up with this older person who's homeless, often with no money, and any access through the court system is really complex and time-consuming and often not the answer or resolve their issues. In terms of responding to we see a lot of people come through otherwise who have already been experiencing elder abuse. So in that process, we really walk through the older person to explore all the options available to them, which includes self-help. Sometimes, for example, it might be as simple as they have a person that's in their house that they don't want to be there and they can simply just change the locks. It might be talking to them and exploring whether or not mediation is an option. Quite often an older person is really reluctant to go to court. They really want to be able to resolve the dispute themselves, often with the abuser, and really want to consider mediation or go through mediation, and we talk to them about whether or not that's appropriate in the circumstances, which also requires a bit of reflection around where's the abuser or perpetrator's understanding and insight into this situation, and is it likely to be able to produce an outcome. We also would look at things like sending letters of demand or letters to vacate. Sometimes it might be assisting them with applying for a family violence restraining order. Sometimes it might be drafting up a granny flat arrangement, so a deed of agreement that sets out what happens if the older person sells their house, for example, and moves in with their children. We also help with making appropriate referrals to services. So we know that a lot of the time the abuse, and particularly the financial abuse, impacts on the older person's financial situation, for example, with Centrelink. And so it might be that we will also support them to be referred to the Welfare Rights and Advocacy Service so they can get some specific advice around their situation and the best way to manage it. Importantly, although our clients are the older person, we do get many phone calls from concerned family members, friends and service providers. And although they can't become our clients, our advocates do provide information to them on what their options might be, and including a bit of a framework. So they will walk them through the process of doing a safe, a risk assessment, both to their physical safety as well as to the safety of their assets. Because it might be that urgent action needs to be taken if some key assets are about to be disposed of and they need to be preserved. They will also walk them through, they will encourage the third person to try and get the older person to be able to make contact with us and to brainstorm how that can be, because we appreciate that often the abuser may be limiting the older person's ability to be able to access services. They will also provide information around SAT. They'll provide information about potentially making a report to the Office of the Public Advocate where there's concerns that the harm being caused to the older person relates to decision-making disability, and they'll also refer them to other non-legal service providers. As I said earlier, mediation, but also case management. There are services who provide a case management approach where their role is really to empower the older person through the conflict and dispute. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks so much, Rowena. We're now going to hear from Senior Sergeant Damien Brown, and he is with the WA Police Family Violence Division. So I'll hand over to you, Damien.
Thank you. Thanks, Christina. As Rowena mentioned, the age limit or the age bracket for elder abuse, and she said it was 65 years or 55 years for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which is correct. And it's based on the Commonwealth position and our state government position. Conversely to that, the West Australian Police Force has aligned itself to the age 60. So that's because at law, a person aged 60 is deemed to be a vulnerable person for the purposes of sentencing options in court. So we would refer to that as circumstances of aggravation at sentencing, and it gives different options to a magistrate or a judge to impose a penalty which is perhaps higher than those penalties for other age brackets. So for WA Police at 60 years old, Christina mentioned the definition of elder abuse. So as she said, it was the World Health Organisation's position, it's also the state government position, and it's also the position of the WA Police Force. The important part of that definition is to understand that the abuse must be between persons where there's an expectation of trust. So in that regard, a person who is an older person and their home is perhaps burgled by a complete stranger, that's not elder abuse, because they don't know the offender, they don't know the perpetrator. There's no expectation of trust or relationship between the parties. So if you think about what an expectation of trust is, it quite neatly aligns itself to the definition of a family relationship when we talk about family violence. So family relationships are what you would typically think to be people who are married or parent-child relationships, or brother and sister, or in fact blood relations. But there's a clause in the Restraining Orders Act that essentially says it can be a relationship of a domestic nature where the lives of persons involved are interrelated and the actions of one person affects the other. So this broadens what a family relationship is to relationships between older persons and friends or carers. If the friend or carer provides a service to the older person, and such as cleaning, cooking, paying finances, whether formally or informally, the police will consider it to be a family relationship. So where there's a family relationship in place and family violence is occurring, then that neatly aligns itself to what elder abuse might look like. Family violence is violence, threats of violence, behaviour that's coercive or controlling, or any other behaviour that causes a person to be afraid. So if elder abuse is aligned to family violence, police officers will, on attendance, take a family violence incident report if a police officer takes a family violence incident report, then it opens up other options once that report is taken for the police to share the report with our partner agencies in the Department of Communities or Community Resources Services. As a result of that, further support can be offered to the victim in the matter, such as financial advice, provision of housing, health advice, or counselling referrals. So if a person was to report elder abuse to police, what would police do? Elder abuse will typically be things like physical violence, sexual violence, assaults, property damage, stalking, deprivation of liberty, threatening behaviours, stealings or frauds and other like offences. They're criminal allegations and they'll be investigated criminally. Police officers will attend and they'll conduct an investigation. The police officers may be equipped with body-worn cameras. If so, the direction to police officers when attending family violence incidents, which will include elder abuse, is to record all family violence incidents. They should advise the people who they contact that the camera is operating and it's been recording. Officers will continue to record the interaction even if the persons involved want the camera turned off, provided the officer believes they are collecting evidence, or if the incident is still occurring or is likely to continue, or if the recording will capture the transparency of the interaction between the officers and the persons involved. Older persons are assumed competent to make informed choices and decisions about their own lives until that's determined otherwise. Police officers will investigate impartially to seek the truth of an allegation, and this may involve interviewing all witnesses, interviewing suspects, looking for corroboration such as CCTV video or medical reports, examining documentation like bank records, searching for items of relevance such as credit cards, phones, weapons or clothing, and reviewing police records to find out the past information about those persons involved. Many people who report matters to police may not have had involvement with police in the past or perhaps infrequently. Police officers are committed to investigating. They will be tenacious and yet balanced by being objective. If you're involved in a matter that's being reported to police, be honest with the investigating officers and do not feel offended by their interest to seek all the information possible. Police officers will make observations of the victim. They'll be looking for signs of physical abuse, such as abrasions, dislocations, fractures, sprains, or pressure areas, or perhaps the victim may just even recoil from being touched. Police will also look for signs of financial offending, such as there's been a failure to pay rent or other bills, there's an unexplained depletion of savings, if someone's managing finances of somebody who is seemingly competent, if there's a reluctance to make a will or accept budget advice by the older person, perhaps some possessions of the older person have simply disappeared, or there's signatures on documents and cheques that do not resemble the senior person's signature. Elder abuse may also present in ways which are defined as family violence, although they may not be offences as defined by law. These are typically known as coercion and controlling behaviours. They include social isolation, cultural isolation, a resistance to provide physical or intellectual stimulation, being told what to wear, being told what to eat and when to eat it, emotional abuse and the like. Police will look for signs that a victim is being abused, such as in their demeanour. Are they seem to be depressed? Are they ashamed? Are they showing fear? Do they appear malnourished? Have they got injuries that have not been properly cared for or not being provided medication? Perhaps their clothing is in poor repair or inappropriate for the season, poor personal hygiene, and perhaps there's some lack of safety precautions around the home or appropriate supervision of the older person. Lifestyle risk indicators will also be recorded by police. This information may be shared with our partner government and non-government support agencies. This includes family conflicts, health or cognitive impairment, language or cultural barriers, or other parties addicted to substance abuse. That can be the senior person or caring people. Or perhaps there's evidence of poverty or financial issues. No consent is needed for police officers to share information about people who are victims of family violence with prescribed agencies. The Children and Community Services Act provides explicit legislative support to share information with the prescribed agencies, and we will do so. So when we think about prosecutions, the police will look at, is there sufficient evidence gathered that an offence has been committed, that the suspect identified as the person who committed the offence, then it will be open for police to prosecute the suspect. It's here that the views of the victim are particularly important, and a willingness to cooperate will be sought from police. Elder abuse is more often committed in a family relationship with older persons. It's a very difficult decision for a person to agree to a prosecution when they have known or been related to the other party for their entire life. The ramifications of prosecuting another person can fracture relationships with them. It can be a difficult decision for a person to commit to that course of action. So an older person needs to think, do you want the abuse to stop? Do you want the persons who abused you to be held to account? Understand that police have the ultimate authority to prosecute or not, but they should be guided by the older person's decision. There are some circumstances where family violence has been identified and the family violence is either not an offence or there's not sufficient evidence to consider a criminal prosecution. In such cases, victims have a power to seek a family violence restraining order to protect them from abuse. Attending police officers may also recognise situations where a short-term protective order, which is 72 hours or less, is needed to ensure the safety of a victim. This is known as a police order. Police made short-term police orders for 47% of attendances in 2021. For longer-term protection, a victim can make application to a court seeking for a person to be prevented from communicating with or being within a set distance of a victim, or any other term is needed to stop the violence. Restraining orders may strain personal relationships, but they are a valuable protection where a victim has the power to determine the level of behaviour to be constrained. I recommend that older persons seek legal advice to see if a restraining order can help stop the abuse for them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Damien. So you've heard some very comprehensive information from a number of sectors about what they can do to respond to allegations of elder abuse. And what I think is obvious is that the onus is still very much on the victim to come forward. Now we know that only about 14% of elder abuse is actually reported. And there are also many unanswered questions when it comes to elder abuse. We're now going to go into a bit more of an informal chat, and I'm going to ask our speakers some questions that may be questions that you have too. And I'm going to do this randomly. And so let me ask Gianna, why can't you assist when an older person is being abused but doesn't want any help?
I think we've covered that, sort of all of us have touched on that point that, you know, the older person, you know, sort of needs to acknowledge the abuse and want to proceed with changing that situation. But the more common scenario, again, I think that most of us have touched on, is other people being concerned for the older person's welfare. So in the setting that I work, in the health setting, we will occasionally get calls from the community, like a neighbour or someone that's observing something that's not quite right in a relationship. And wanting us to, you know, sort of look into it. So, yeah, unfortunately, unless that person is prepared to be identified to the older person, there's not a lot that we can do. But we will go to great efforts, you know, to try and encourage the person to be prepared to speak to the older person themselves and let them know that there is help out there. Or even just to let us even engage with the older person and let them know that they've got a concerned neighbour or a concerned friend that has let us know about the situation. But we always need that first point of call. But we will always try and work as creatively as possible. One of the services that we have in our health service is the Rehabilitation, Aged and Intervention Liaison Service. And it's a particular service, we refer to it as RAILS, and it's a particular service that can, you know, sort of GPs can contact, community members can contact if there is an older person of concern in the community. As far as, you know, sort of not being safe or being mistreated. And that service can be a little bit more creative and perhaps, you know, sort of pop in and just, you know, sort of let the person know that there's someone concerned, they've observed this or that. RAILS will quite often also contact other agencies. I found that really interesting that Damien says that they've got the authority to contact other agencies and disclose information, etc. We would probably tend to need to be a little bit more sensitive and confidential about the information, but we would try and engage as much as possible to overcome that limitation of the person not wanting to proceed with getting support.
Okay, thanks, Gianna. Damien, if I can ask you, what's the most common type of offence that's reported in regard to elder abuse to police?
Yeah, so from my research from 2021 calendar year, for 25% of the attendances, police did not record any offence. So in a quarter of all police attendances, there's not necessarily criminality being alleged. It's probably more coercion and controlling behaviours that is of concern. Sadly, thereafter, it's assaults. Assaults were reported in 43% of the police attendances in 2021. After that, it's breach of restraining orders. So that's can be seen as a positive, whereby the older person has taken some action, or police have taken some action to afford themselves some protection by obtaining a restraining order. And thereafter, 12% of the occasions there was a breach of that order. But I suppose that by an order being in place, some positive action was able to be done at that time. And the other larger percentages is damaging of property, whereby somebody's damaged the property of the older person, and there's a raft of other type of offending. Thereafter, cars are being stolen. There's fraud, of course, and stealings and those sorts, but they're in no great numbers. But the main concern is the physical violence, and that ranges from common assault through to bodily harm offending that's being reported to police, and 43% of attendances have that dynamic, and it's not acceptable.
I think what we've highlighted today is the multiple types of abuse that occur, and some that maybe even people don't think of. I might just ask Rowena to give us an example about the type, if you can, without revealing too many details, a bit of a case study on a complex case that you've managed and how you get an outcome.
Certainly. Thanks, Christine. I think one of the issues that's quite commonly presenting at the moment is older people who have allowed their adult, quite often children, to move back into the home because the adult child has, is having some issues themselves at the moment, and they're wanting to help out their child. The older person moves back home, and there hasn't been any discussion really around what the expectations of each other is. Quite often there hasn't been conversations around how does the rent get shared, how does electricity get paid, and the relationship breaks down. The older person becomes very fearful. Often there hasn't been physical violence, but it's a feeling or a fear that there is going to be physical violence. And it's to the point that they start not wanting to come out of their bedroom, not wanting to leave the house, or not, so that's the point that they come to me and they say, what are my options? And that's the point that we really walk through with them. The starting point is, what kind of house is it? The response might vary if it's their own home versus if it's a unit that they're renting from housing. It also will depend on whether or not the arrangement falls within the ambit of the Residential Tenancies Act. For example, say it might be that the person was living in a granny flat, and there's issues about whether or not there was a lease and whether or not there's notice periods that may apply versus whether they're just a lodger. We will then walk them through, do some safety planning with them. And we have had situations where even in terms of the safety planning, we haven't been able to progress because actually the adult person's been engaging in illegal activities in the home. And the older person has then been worried about, well, what's going to be the consequences to me if the police get involved? Am I going to be charged? So at that point, we actually had to get some advice from one of our criminal lawyers then and there because, like I said, we couldn't even do safety planning without being able to deal with that issue. Once that advice had been delivered, we were then able to talk about and he gave us permission to then work with a daughter who lived away, and we can then work with the family to try and work out if that person wanted to go down the path of getting a family violence restraining order, for example, how it could be done in a way that he was going to feel safe. Particularly, we could help him with the application, but the big concern became then, okay, if the police come and serve that order, what might be the consequences? So we then worked with family to make sure that he had a safe place to stay at that time. There was also going to be very significant concerns that that adult child was actually, even after the order had been served, he was very likely to then just go into hiding and come back into the property and potentially create, damage that property, for example. So we then had to work again, we'd work with family to look at how some of that property could be preserved. And just supporting him, like I said, through that whole process of actually applying for a family violence restraining order, where one of the terms can be that the person is restrained from bringing in that house. And also in this case, it wouldn't be uncommon to say, I don't actually want any contact with that person for a period of time. But with there being some provisions in there, for example, that the abuser might still need to come back to the house, for example, to collect their property. So we might put a clause into the order that would say, there's to be no contact except via a lawyer or some other third party we can support through that process.
Okay, thanks. And Gianna, can I ask you a similar question? Where do the people you're supporting, how do they come to you? What's the process for them coming to you?
Within the hospital system, it's social workers really only have a role with patients that are coming in for medical treatment, etc. So in the inpatient setting, it's quite often because a person's had an acute medical event that's led them to be admitted to hospital. At Sir Charles Gardner, it may, sort of be a whole range of things. It may be it may be that they've needed surgery, sort of along the way, it's been, observed that this person may be in an abusive relationship. So it's very much reliant on the team making the referral. At Osborne Park, social workers are a little bit more automatically involved with all of our inpatients because it's predominantly rehabilitation that they are at Osborne Park for. So it tends to be a longer stay, more intensive, looking at what's led to them not managing in the community. So social work will routinely be involved and will be, looking at sort of the older person and their relationships, etc. In the outpatient setting, again, it's quite often reliant on the other members of the health team that may observe that something's not quite right and they would be referring to the social work team. In our aged care assessment teams, the social workers and nurses that go into people's homes to assess them for aged care services, they're very much lone practitioners and they automatically are doing a screening for elder abuse. So really it depends on how they're in our system as to how proactive we can be with looking at elder abuse as an issue.
Okay, thanks, Gianna. So we're coming almost to the end of our session, but I think it's important to reiterate that the onus remains on the victim to come forward, and we encourage, where they are willing to share that information, that they do so. But I believe, and COTA believes, that there is still a responsibility for us to create awareness of elder abuse within the community and to start to change some of the behaviours and the attitudes to older people, and particularly elder abuse. Now, what we've focused on today has been predominantly what we can do, or what the different sectors can do to respond to elder abuse. But I really think we also need to acknowledge that there are challenges, and sometimes we are not able to deal with particular issues. Just want to throw open to our speakers, if we could change one thing to make it, to reduce the incidence of elder abuse, does anybody have any idea? So obviously from a COTA point of view, we want to see more public awareness, more campaigns, and changing behaviours rather than leaving the onus on older people. Does anybody have any opinions in what they would like to see, what we can do?
I think from a legal perspective, and certainly our service, we get many calls from concerned third parties because they don't know where to go. They are really worried that their family member, their friend is being abused, and that older person is unlikely to seek help themselves. And currently there's no mandatory reporting obligations, there's no one body that those concerned people can actually report those concerns to, and there be an investigation, and through that process the older person empowered. So at the moment we do have the Office of the Public Advocate who can do their inquiries where the harm or abuse relates to decision-making disability. But for many of the people that we are getting these calls about, they're not in that cohort. It is people who have capacity, who are not being able to have a voice in this process. And I think that's probably something that we really do need to look at.
And in your respective sectors, are you seeing an increase in this type of abuse? Damien?
No, not an increase, no. It's probably a steady or consistent amount of reports to police over the years. Typically, as I said before, it's a big and brave and bold decision for people to make to have police become involved. So it's suspected that there's a lot more elder abuse in the community than perhaps is being reported to police. Police are only one part of the entire response, and they have a role to provide immediate safety and to investigate offending. Beyond that, there's a lot more I think that can be done by non-government and other government departments in the space of elder abuse. In particular, the advert that was at the beginning of this session highlighted how it's not acceptable in the context of a young woman being incapacitated. So why is it any different for an older person with similar incapacitations perhaps? So prevention and advertising, I think, could be ramped up to create awareness. A lot of people perhaps don't even recognise themselves as to what they're doing to their loved ones and what consequences that can possibly have. So I think that's a positive thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. And very briefly, Irene, your thoughts?
I think awareness. I think as a society we probably need to be more aware that this happens. I agree, we definitely need somewhere to be able to go as a central point, because that would also give us data. And statistically, when we have data, then we have some information to know where to put the pressure points or to spend the resources to get the best value. I'd also like to see a state or national database for EPAs and EPGs, or enduring power of attorney and guardianships, because at the moment there isn't, and so people can have these in place and other people not know it, because the person they thought that would be the one that would help them through that suddenly isn't around, or they have lack of capacity. So I think that would be a good starting point as well. And I really think it needs to be something that is taught at a young age about any sort of abuse. So we talk about domestic violence, and I think older abuse actually is part of that probably that life acceptance that people have had of abuse within their family or their culture. And I think starting young and getting people to recognise, whether it be themselves or for others, that it's not acceptable that anybody has their liberty or their rights taken away from them or is abused. So
that's a really good note to end this forum on. We need to protect the rights of older people, and they have a human right to live safely and protected within the environment. Now, clearly there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's heartening to know that there is a lot of support for our sector, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for sharing their insights with us. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. So thank you everybody for watching. Have a great day.